Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial and welcome to our brand new theatre. My name is Dr Carl James and I'm the Head of Military History here at the Memorial. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. We are very excited this afternoon to welcome Dr Mark Johnston to deliver his talk in our brand new theatre. Mark's presentation, Last Words in a Long War, Australians in the Pacific in 1945, is part of our special program of events commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. This program includes free monthly author talks, a special performance of the play 21 Hearts, Vivian Bullwinkle and the Nurses of the Viner Brook, and on the 15th of August, there will be a special half-day symposium titled Interpreting Australia's Second World War, previewing Anzac Hall. Before we start, however, I'd ask that you please be mindful of the following courtesies for the comfort and safety of all visitors. Please be aware that food and drink, except for water, are not permitted in the theatre or the memorial's galleries. And please turn your mobile phones to silent. The fire exits are located behind you to the rear of the room into the theatre. And in the event of an evacuation, please follow the directions of memorial staff. The bathrooms are located outside beyond the doors, just past the shop and the cloaking room. Memorial staff will be happy to provide any further information or assistance if required. I'd now like to introduce Dr Mark Johnston. Now, Mark is probably the leading expert of the experience of Australian soldiers during the Second World War. His work is regularly cited in academic and popular works, and his approach to history and how we think about Australia's involvement in the Second World War has been hugely influential to myself personally and professionally, as well as I know to many other people in the room today. Now, a real overachiever, Mark has published 12 books and has not one, but two new books coming out later this year. And his publications include the classic works At the Front Line, Experiences of Australian Soldiers in World War II, and Fighting the Enemy, Australian Soldiers and Their Adversaries in World War II, as well as many other works. And his most recent here is his edited work on Derrick VC in his own words. And you can see, not only do I own my own copy, but I've read it, I've taken notes, and I've marked it up with post-it notes and stuff. So I actually bought the book and I've read it and made notes. Now, in addition to his many other works, Mark has also been a regular contributor to Wartime magazine, and I'm confident that he will become a regular contributor to a new WM magazine, which is the War Memorials magazine available now. Without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Mark Johnston.
Thanks, Carl. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. Although I'm going to focus today on the fascinating year of 1945, I want to start by talking about two documents concerning 1942. The setting's the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. The date's the night of the 28th to 29th of October. The 2nd, 13th and 2nd, 15th battalions have been ordered to advance north and create a base for further operations. Here's an official account of what happened. So it says the attack by both the battalions proceeded entirely according to plan. The 2nd 15th reached the first company objectives at 23:16 hours and its final objective at 23:52 without encountering any minefields. Its casualties were very light and it proceeded to dig in without serious difficulty. Now I want to read an account by someone who was actually involved in that action in the 2nd 15th Battalion, a guy called Private Eric Lambert. This picture is not of that actual action, but it's of that battalion fighting the month before, and it's evocative of the sort of thing that he said about it. He said, almost as soon as our own barrage began, the Hun replied, and he was right among us. Captain Jubb was badly hit. How I came through it, God only knows. Men on either side of me were falling, and I became convinced I bore a charmed life and no longer bothered to go to ground. Ahead of us loomed a ridge. Machine guns pelted it from both sides. The bullets as they came past me were like comets. We doubled over and into soft white sand. A mad flash revealed low bushes and white sand, the black shadows of men falling, cries, supplications, laughs, and the din. Passing through the post taken by the company in front, All its defenders lay dead in trenches except one whom I sent careering fearfully back with his arms up. Past here death and blood came thick among us. For a moment chaos and disorganisation reigned, but the line reformed, the shells cut among us like scythes. Men wandered everywhere, bleeding, hoarse, distracted. 1,000 yards past that post we began to dig like things possessed, expecting the counterattack. And it's a massive contrast to that account, isn't it? It exemplifies some of the problems of writing accurate military history. Writing about combat's notoriously difficult. The Duke of Wellington famously likened telling the history of a battle to telling the history of a ball or dance. Now I'll show you a few examples of the same phenomenon from 1945. The first is from a book that I have coming out later this year called Australian Heroes of World War II. In the introduction, I talk about the difficulty of obtaining the truth about deeds for which men were recommended for medals, and give this example. So this is about Corporal Alan Rose, a soldier who received a military medal in the Itapi-Wewak campaign of 1945, and his citation follows. And this citation was written on about the 1st of August 1945 about a soldier who was very brave. There's various accounts of things he'd done earlier in the war that leave no doubt he was a courageous person. But look at the citation. It talks about events on two dates, the 25th of April and the 17th of June. On the 25th of April, he was on a patrol that was ambushed, and he rescued a wounded scout called Private Ryan. And then on the 17th of June, he was on a patrol where his brother was wounded. He killed several men, including 3 with a fixed bayonet, it tells us in the citation. Interestingly, though, these remarkable feats that he achieved according to the citation are not mentioned in the army history, the very detailed history of the final campaigns, or in the history of the 2nd 6th Battalion, of which he was a member, even though the 2nd 6th Battalion history does mention both those patrols. Moreover, the citation implies that G. Ryan, who's mentioned on the 25th of April bit, was rescued when actually he was killed in action on that patrol. The battalion war diary for the 25th of April mentions Ryan's death in the ambush and the mortar wounds inflicted on another Australian, but says nothing about Rose. And the diary's entry for the 17th of June refers to no action that squares with the events described in the citation. But the patrol led by Rose, in which his brother was wounded, is described in the previous day's entry, where it says enemy casualties were 2 wounded, not the 3 killed that were mentioned as being bayoneted by Rose. So what to make of such a story where many of the details are conflicting? And just one more example of this type. This is an extract from the war diary of the 2nd 48th Battalion about its fighting on the island of Tarakan on the 20th of May 1945. And if you look at the section from where it talks about at first light, you'll see it's talking about the different platoons of A Company. The first one it mentions is 7 platoon of A Company moving out to find the best route along which to attack Freda. So Freda was the name of a hill. There were many of these features all over Tarakan that had to be captured. And you'll see it mentions there 9 platoon moving up the eastern knoll, and then towards the bottom 9 platoon locating the enemy on each of 4 knolls of Freda and on the southern slopes. And as a result of this fresh information of the enemy strength, A Company moved back to Agnes. So it's a pretty dry account of the various platoons of A Company doing things. Now let's look at an extract from the diary of a soldier who was involved in those events. It's the diary of Lieutenant Tom Derrick, who commanded 7 Platoon. I'm not going to decipher it here and now, but I did for that Derrick book. You can see the writing was not always easy to read. This is actually a transcript of what he said. And again, it talks about 7 Platoon moving to Freda, 8 Platoon on a right flank move, 7 Platoon moving up behind 9 Platoon. He talks too about I shot 1 Japanese who was wounded and crawling away. 7 Platoon took over this position. Now this is the bit that is quite different than anything that's said in the diary, the war diary. 9 Platoon moved on when only 100 yards and reported could go no further. Something wrong in this platoon. It's a bad show. My platoon definitely are well ahead of the other 2. The company retired to Agnes again at 16:15. So here again is one of these contrasts between accounts. There's a sting in the tail of that one, and he'd made critical comments the day before in his diary about 9 Platoon, calling one of its moves badly done, an attempt to cut the track definitely a bad show. So what about the official history on the same event? It says on the 20th of May, after early morning patrols from Derrick's platoon had returned, it was decided to advance along Freda from east to west. 16 aircraft dropped napalm on the Japanese area, but the attacking infantry found the feature too strongly held and again withdrew. So that's pretty prosaic. Gavin Long was the general editor of the 22-volume official history of Australia in World War II. It was a titanic effort to oversee this. He wrote 2 of the volumes himself, and the work he oversaw remains an indispensable source, which I'll be mentioning several times. But I hope the examples I show illustrate the difficulty of pinning down the truth of events in military history, and they hint too at a dark side to events that often seem clear-cut. I'll return to that point. First, though, let's think about some overarching facts about the Australians in 1945. In commemorating the 80th anniversary of World War II, we are, of course, remembering an event that Australians welcomed at the time. It brought victory for a noble cause over opponents who intended to enslave the world. It ended a period of extraordinary self-denial and risk, and reunited servicemen and women with families they hadn't seen for a long time. There was another side of 1945, though. That year's operations were no cakewalk for Australia. Look at these figures revealed when one looks up war deaths on the War Memorial's wonderful digital roll of honour. No fewer than 6,820 Australians died while serving that year. And if we look at a list of the numbers for each year of the war, only 2 other years, namely 42 and 43, saw more Australian deaths than 1945. That's a remarkable fact when you consider that in 1941, for example, 3 of our infantry divisions saw heavy action, as did the Air Force and Navy. In this talk, I'll discuss some of the men who didn't make it to celebrate victory in the Pacific Day in August 1945. They spoke their last words in that year. I'm here because I'm an author about 1945. My first 2 books were about themes in the Australian experience of World War II. They weren't written with chapters in chronological order, but discussed issues that ran throughout the war, particularly relating to life at the front line, combat and enemies. After that, my books have tended to be chronological. It's much easier to write them that way, especially when, as a busy school teacher, you have to leave the writing for weeks or months at a time. If it's chronological, it's easy to take up where you left off than if you're writing chapters about complex topics like, for example, how Australians felt about the Germans in World War II. You can imagine that when I get to the 1945 chapter in a book, I tend to be glad that the end's in sight. It's also the period of the war when sources tend to be unusually good. I think, for example, it has the best photographic coverage of any year of the war. Here's an example, although you'll realise too that this exemplifies a problem with sources in that it's been colorised. Until very recently, 1945 was also the year about which you were most likely to be able to interview veterans. Sadly, there's virtually no one left, of course. Sadly, it's also a year surrounded by strong emotions, notably anger about wasted lives and a sense of poignancy about people who didn't make it despite getting so close to the end of the peace. The latter category includes Tom Derrick VC DCM, who'll be well known to many of you and whom I've already mentioned in passing. I'm going to tell you about him, but also about some lesser known stories. I'll concentrate exclusively on the war in the Pacific in 1945, though I'm well aware that many Australians were fighting in Europe that year, especially in the air. As an illustration of that, I'll mention that I'm engaged in a project on the war dead of the school where I teach, Scotch College in Melbourne. 48 former students and staff, including this chap, died while serving in 1945. And no fewer than 14 of those 48 died in Europe serving in the RAAF or RAF. Another 10 died as prisoners of war, mostly of the Japanese. And I'm afraid I won't be dwelling on that important group either, prisoners of war. The Pacific's a massive topic in itself, involving hundreds of thousands of Australians. And that's apparent when we look at maps of the area of operations. So there were separate campaigns in these places. Northern New Guinea, often called the Itapi-Wewak campaign after the beginning and end points of the fighting. And you can see these places are marked on this map. New Britain, where the Japanese had their great South Pacific base at Rabaul. Bougainville, and Borneo, where between May and July, 2 divisions made 3 major landings, each involving some tough fighting. From Itapi in New Guinea to Buin in Bougainville is more than 1,500 kilometres. From Miri in Borneo to Buin, it's about 4,800 kilometres. That's nearly twice the distance from Paris to Moscow. A vast area over which to transport troops and supplies, to provide air cover, and although there's a lot of sea in between, it's a vast area over which troops had to march. It means too there was a wide range of experiences. The RAAF supported all these operations and also flew separate operations, especially in the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. You'll notice that all of these campaigns were in tropical climates. Writing about jungle warfare isn't easy, as David Dexter wrote in the preface to his volume in the official history, which concerns the 1943-4 campaigns, where he talks about the front line and says, if operations along a gloomy jungle track, on a rain-drenched razorback, or in the stifling kunai can be so described as a front line, inevitably it's a story of individuals and small subunits on patrol in ambush, attack or defence. This wasn't a war of mass battalions, but of the forward scout, section, platoon and company. So obviously writing about what units did is more difficult in that jungle environment than the desert. Arthur Wallen, who was a veteran of the 1943 campaigns, thought 1945 was similar, and he wrote in his diary, after the open ridges travelled and I enter the dim-lighted jungle, dripping foliage, squelching mud and water, often feel sort of depressed and suffocated. Maybe memories of other days patrolling along similar tracks, always waiting for that ambush to be sprung on oneself. What a wonderfully evocative passage, but it exemplifies the difficulty of writing the truth about the lonely fighting in 1945, or in the jungle generally. Wallen was aware of similarities, but an obvious question about 1945 is in what ways was campaigning in that year any different from the war's earlier years? One difference is that the war was clearly going to be won by the Allies, and that the campaigns being fought by Australians were not going to be crucial to that victory. Australians in northern New Guinea, Bougainville and New Britain had taken over from American garrisons, thus freeing them up for use in campaigns closer to Japan. The Americans had been content to leave their Japanese opponents to wither on the vine, whereas the Australian military leaders, notably General Blamey, felt that Australians in these areas needed to be more aggressive than the Americans. He said in August 1944 that the coming campaigns of 1945 would involve the army making its maximum effort during the war. Like these campaigns, the landings in Borneo were of dubious significance to the outcome of the conflict, but the American commander in the Southwest Pacific, General MacArthur, was keen for them to proceed. Australian troops on the ground thus had reasons to be half-hearted in their approach to the fighting that's being called an unnecessary war. Let's look at each campaign briefly, with an eye to telling you something you may not have heard before. We'll start with what the 6th Division, the 1st Division raised in the 2nd RAF, was doing in northern New Guinea from the first day of 1945 till war's end. General Blamey sent the division there because he wanted to give this elite formation a substantial task after a long period of inactivity, more than 3 years for some units. When during the voyage the destination was revealed as the Itapi area, some 6th Division troops felt insulted at this sending of, quote, men on a boy's errand, unquote, but felt that it was at least preferable to everlasting training. The Australians were outnumbered by a force of about 35,000 Japanese, but were far better equipped and supplied than their enemies, for whom food shortages were a huge problem to a point where some resorted to cannibalism. The Australians had naval and especially air support, but knew that their campaign was a low Allied priority and that the strategic value of the operations was dubious. Nevertheless, as the official historian acknowledged, in each attack, veterans and young soldiers performed deeds of fine gallantry, as I've quoted up there. Now, on this point, we come across one of those tricky problems with evidence. A Japanese source, in Peter Williams' wonderful collection of Japanese testimonies about the war, cast some doubt on that gallantry. Major Masso Horry, a staff officer with the 51st Division and the 18th Army headquarters, claimed, "If we were in the same position the Australians were in 1945 in New Guinea around Wewak, we wouldn't have hidden in holes and let the artillery do the job. That method took forever. We would certainly have solved our problems quickly with a determined charge. The Australians never charged. More typically, they'd move forward so slowly that by the time they found our position, we were gone. That was their tactical system. They never changed and they never charged." Naturally enough, to Australians, that judgment seems harsh. Although the 6th Division was notoriously miserly in the distribution of medals, its men won many decorations for gallantry in this campaign, including 2 Victoria Crosses, its only ones for the war. One of those, a posthumous one to Bert Chown, involved that lieutenant first knocking out 2 machine guns with grenades, then leading his platoon in a charge. It's true that the division used its superior firepower to minimise casualties, and casualty numbers for the campaign are telling. In 10 months, the Australians in New Guinea lost 442 dead, Japanese 9,000, a ratio of 20 to 1. In the same period, the Japanese were driven from 7,700 square kilometres of ground, and the 6th Division advanced over 110 kilometres, overcoming great logistical challenges as it undertook dual advances along the coast and in the mountains. Moreover, it was a campaign fought on a shoestring. Obtaining sea and air transport was challenging, and there were often shortages of items such as aerial bombs. The Air Force was doing all it could to help, though. To give one example, in March 1945, Australian commandos captured a village called Millac, 2 days' march from the nearest Australians. For 5 days, the Japanese besieged 40 commandos there. While the defenders fought with great courage, No. 100 Squadron Beauforts gave crucial support too. In the words of the commando history, from 1,500 feet they were seen, quote, approaching straight as though drawn on strings, dropped bombs and strafed to within 50 feet of our weapon pits. During this raid, the horrified troopers saw a Beaufort, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Jack Fowler, disintegrate in a ball of fire when its bombs detonated prematurely. Aircrew of No. 100 Squadron had earlier gone on patrol with the commandos to witness their methods of communicating with the crews. And the troops had come to see this RAAF squadron as, quote, true brothers in arms. This is Fowler's crew, including Flight Sergeant Jeff Waite, who'd been mentioned in dispatches for distinguished services. The former policeman had left England 11 years earlier with his wife. The widow's badge she received as acknowledgement of her loss is now here in the War Memorial. The man pictured second from the left here, returning from a patrol, was preoccupied with minimising casualties. He's Captain Owen Williams, Regimental Medical Officer of the 2nd 4th Battalion. Williams wrote home that jungle patrols were pretty grim work. In July 1945, Lieutenant Jim Brown, also pictured here, was leading a patrol when a man was hit. Williams rushed forward to his aid, only to be shot and mortally wounded. The War Memorial holds a private records collection, including Williams' last letter home, in which he talked about this photo. It also contains numerous letters from men inside and outside the 2nd 4th of high and low rank, testifying to Williams' courage and integrity. He received an MBE for service in this, his final campaign. Publicity for the ITP Wewak campaign struck the participants as inadequate. The same applied even more forcefully in Bougainville, where the involvement of Australian troops was not mentioned in the Australian press for months, as this anonymous soldier's letter attests. You can see he said, I don't suppose it makes much difference, but after 6.5 months here, we're allowed now to say we're on Bougainville. Seeing they announced the arrival of the 9th on Tarakan in a few days, and now they've given the 6th headlines for their efforts in the ITP Wewak area, I suppose they've shamed themselves into at least letting our people know the 3rd Division has this campaign. Perhaps later on the boys in New Britain may be able to disclose what division is there. So when the Australians set up headquarters at Torokina on Bougainville, they estimated enemy strength at 18,000. In fact, it was about 40,000, many more than the Australian force comprising the 3rd Division and 2 independent brigades. In accordance with Australia's aggressive approach in the final campaigns, they launched 3 offensives in the south, north and centre. This map's taken from Carl James's excellent book on the Bougainville campaign. It's called The Hard Slog, and that's what the campaign was for participants. As the anonymous complaint I just read shows, the campaign involved battalions that were originally part of the militia, or CMF. Most men in those battalions volunteered for the AAF while in the militia, and hence their CMF units gained AAF status. But that's not the way many non-members categorised them. A poignant story concerns the man pictured at right here, Private Clifford Summers of the 9th Battalion. Unlike most frontline Australian soldiers, he was conscripted. As the son of strict Salvation Army parents, he abhorred the prospect of killing his fellow men. He asked to be a stretcher bearer. Although that wish was fulfilled, his experiences only confirmed his distaste for war. This teenage South Australian with a negative attitude found it difficult to settle into his Queensland battalion, though he did make a mate in a fellow stretcher bearer, Private Edwin Barges. This photo was actually taken on the 29th of November 1944 at the start of the Bougainville campaign at Little George Hill. It was the first Australian attack of the campaign and the first battle for Summers and many others in his battalion. It proved traumatic for him, for he saw his mate Barges shot and killed. This event had a huge impact on him then, and for the remaining 68 years of his life he remained bitter about the war. However, he's pictured carrying on, taking down details of a wounded soldier. The 9th Battalion, of which he was part, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Matthews, who kept a diary. When his battalion took over an American outpost in November 1944, he wrote, "They were all excited and glad to get into it." The following week, after his battalion had captured a Japanese outpost, he exulted, "Our boys were wonderful, no hesitation, and right into it." But as Carl and I have testified in various publications, that diary contains evidence of subsequent problems in the unit that most Australians would find surprising. In January 1945, the battalion came under Japanese shelling, suffered casualties on booby traps, and advanced over terrain where there was a constant sense of danger and from which sprang several enemy ambushes and attacks. One man accidentally shot himself in the foot, while another refused to go on patrol. The morale of one company was so low that Matthews sent them back for a rest. The following day, when he ordered a second company to capture enemy artillery pieces that had been firing on the unit, the company commander told him the men were too fatigued. "I ordered him to do it and rang off," Matthews wrote in his diary. Half an hour later, the officer rang to say he'd told his company and no man would leave his position, all refusing duty. I asked why, and they said they were all too tired. They were cut off from the world and couldn't get casualties back and weren't prepared to get any anyway. I told the company commander to order his officers forward, and he said they knew they wouldn't, but he would give it a go. His second in command rang shortly after and said the company commander had cracked up, mental strain, crying. Matthews sacked the company commander and mollified the men by sending them their packs and cooking gear. The following day, there were problems with 3 of the companies, including one company commander saying the men were openly expressing dissatisfaction with Matthews. When the battalion was relieved in late February, loud cheers resulted. After they returned to fighting, though, Matthews used words like the jitters, dropping his bundle, threats that men would not go on, and having to avert a sit-down strike. Now, a diary kept by a private in the 9th Sister Battalion, the 61st, shows similar problems. Here's one example. The battalion's in a bad way, as the men are all cracked up. Today, 9 from D Company and 3 from B refuse to go on patrol, and I believe that A Company patrols only go 200 yards out and sit down. If they send us in again, the companies are going to refuse to go. So things are in a very bad state. Already 2 officers have been sent back for standing up for the men. Nearly all the boys have a vacant look in their eyes and look dazed. His next entry followed 8 months later, in January 1946. Since coming out of action, I've did 3 months field punishment, and even if I had to complete my full sentence, it'd be worth it. 75 of us refused to go back into action until we were again given our leave. It's a long story of bad army administration. So this leaves us wondering what was going on Bougainville, or indeed throughout the army in 1945. These 2 battalions comprised well over 1,000 men. How representative were they? They were of the original CMF, whereas most units that saw frontline service were originally AIF, There seems to be no evidence of entire campaigning original AIF units even considering disobeying orders like this. However, on the only occasion that they fought alongside AIF units at Mill Bay in 1942, the efforts of these two fledgling militia units didn't suffer by comparison with the veterans. Moreover, in 1945, neither unit seems to have been held by senior command to be in disgrace. Indeed, Matthews recorded that in an address in May, a very high-ranking officer gave 9th Battalion the highest praise any unit could have, and that something similar occurred when General Blamey visited in June, as pictured here. This strongly suggests these units didn't perform below general Australian standards. Moreover, the official historian, Gavin Long, says that in the Itapi-Wewak region, the AIF veterans were less enthusiastic than the Australians on Bougainville. Long made that assessment despite being acquainted with many of the facts I've outlined. He had access to and made use of Matthew's diary, though not the sections that I've quoted to you. This Bougainville experience relates to the fact that in all armies, combatants are on a slippery slide to breakdown. Whether in original CMF units the slide tended to be unusually fast and propelled by some internal dynamics, a matter for conjecture. The chief blame for the undisciplined behaviour in the two battalions should surely be laid at the feet of authorities too slow in recognising and reacting when these soldiers have been driven beyond their capacity to endure. Over 30,000 Australians served on Bougainville and over 500 were killed. Many extraordinary acts of bravery were recorded there and 2 Victoria Crosses were earned. Indeed, Matthews recommended men for decorations and reflected with justification on, quote, some mighty work done by his unit. One story of courage that affected me was that of the 24th Battalion's Lieutenant Jack Surrett and Sergeant Jack Knight. During the advance down the Buin Road, Australians found it sown with mines and the surrounding scrub booby-trapped. A brave bomb disposal squad accidentally detonated a booby trap, which killed 2 and seriously wounded their commander, thus putting the unit out of action. Surrett, the pioneer officer of the 24th Battalion, had taken a bomb disposal course and now took over. Surrett used a bayonet to find mines, while Knight worked separately with a mine detector. Many mines had tripwires. Together they deactivated 3 minefields. On the 24th of May, Surrett was examining suspicious-looking vines when a booby trap exploded, inflicting multiple wounds and necessitating his evacuation. I'll give the last word on this campaign to Lieutenant Colonel Harry Dunkley, commanding officer of the 7th Battalion. This former school teacher had won a military cross with the 6th Division in 1941, but held no grudges towards his militiamen. He joined them in the fighting. A bullet seared his cheek during one company attack that he led personally. He killed several Japanese and once described the fighting as a combination of mud wrestling, rugby and murder. He considered his 7th Battalion, quote, a wonderful team of lads. On New Britain, the 5th Australian Division did a remarkable job, gradually occupying the whole island except the Gazelle Peninsula. This area up here. It lost 42 killed and 122 wounded and counted 206 Japanese dead. As Gavin Long put it, one understrength Australian division imprisoned an entire Japanese army of 5 divisions in Rabaul. The 36th Battalion spent some 30 weeks in forward positions on New Britain, a unique record, though admittedly on a quiet front. Pictured here are 19th Battalion men in March. That month, a field censorship report said members of the 19th Australian Infantry Battalion have been noted to state that they're proud to be CMF troops and feel they can do just as good a job in that capacity. The report also quoted an AIF private from the unit saying, "I don't like this battalion, don't get along very well with the crowd in it as they're nearly all militia and they're a bit sour on the AIF." It's an interesting case of the uneasy coexistence of 2 armies, CMF and AIF. On the 1st of May, the 9th Division's 26th Brigade landed on Tarakan Island. In his fine book on Tarakan, recently reissued, Peter Stanley called the campaign an Australian tragedy. It's an apt description. The embodiment of that tragedy is Tom Diver Derrick, who died of wounds there. Through his courage, skill and leadership ability, Derrick had by the time of Tarakan risen from an impoverished background to become an officer in his beloved 2nd 48th Battalion. He could have chosen to miss this final campaign, but he wanted to go. He was a complex person. For example, you'll recall his criticism of 9 platoon. Yet he also took the time to add a note to a letter from a young member of this platoon, reassuring the boy's mother that her son was okay. Sadly, that boy died days later. Moreover, Derrick had himself commanded 9 platoon in 1943. Derrick knew that he was lucky to have survived as long as he had. He could be a difficult subordinate and a demanding leader, but was universally respected. It's easy to look back on his presence on Tarakan as a foredoomed enterprise, but it's important to note that he didn't see it that way. In his diary and his surviving letters from that period, it's clear that he expected to survive the campaign. In a letter to his sister on the 15th of May, he admitted that he'd had some close shaves, quote, and I'm not talking about a razor, but also that he was, quote, as fit as ever, morale well over the 100% and no complaint, and asked her to tell Dad he'd better hold out till I get home. We must have a day on the beer together. Don't know when that'll be. I'm hoping it'll be before Christmas. The following day, he wrote to a friend, the show must be nearing an end. A few pockets still holding out. Wish to Christ mine was. Most of the enemy have gone bush, and I guess it'll end up in patrols clearing the island. Derrick died of wounds on the 24th of May. 224 other Australians died on Tarakan, as did more than 1,500 Japanese. The campaign's main purpose was to open Tarakan's airstrip to Allied use, but the airfield was so badly damaged it wasn't fully operational by war's end. The fighting for North Borneo and Balikpapan was also a misuse of some of Australia's best troops. The cost was heavy, but again much worse for the Japanese. Here the Australians were conscious of their material superiority. One wrote at Balikpapan, as I look round me and see all the equipment we have, I sometimes think it can't be many more months. The Jap was beaten by us when practically all we had was rifles, but now we have so much. Early in the advance on Balikpapan, a flamethrower burst silenced 3 Japanese soldiers in a tunnel. As a second 16th historian noted, it was pathetically symbolic of a lost cause that a Japanese tried vainly to quench the flame with a cup of water. Balikpapan was the 7th Division's smoothest campaign, called by one of its commanders a short, sharp little show, beautifully planned and carried out with dash and speed. It cost the Australians 229 dead, the Japanese up to 2,000. Although most of the men I've mentioned here, such as Derrick and Dunkley, were veterans of several campaigns, by 1945 most frontline troops were relatively new to their battalions. For example, when the 2nd 23rd and 2nd 24th Battalions went into action on Tarakan, more than half of the officers and men of the 2nd 23rd and 60% of the 2nd 24th were entering their first campaign. By April 1945, only 2.6% of members of the 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions had been in the AIF since April 1940 or earlier. I mentioned that Diver Derrick knew he was lucky to have survived as long as he did, as he had. By 1945, unlike him, many veterans were running out of enthusiasm. Early in 1945, when the Minister for the Army reported on interviews with 7th and 9th Division veterans, he referred to their fatalistic outlook and noted, these original members stated that in consecutive campaigns they'd seen their numbers gradually decimated and expressed to me their doubts that if they should again proceed on active service, there was every possibility that they, the remaining members of the old brigade, would become casualties and never return to Australia. The remaining old hands were still vital, maintaining the ethos of each battalion and giving crucial practical training and advice to the newcomers, but much of the energy required in the last campaigns came from new men. This is a very poignant photograph showing one of these veterans who was only 25 years old, Ray Jeanette, and one of the new men, John Laserberg, who's apparently a brave and good soldier, aged just 20, who died in the fighting at Tarakan. Some 20 RAAF squadrons of the 1st Tactical Air Force supported the Borneo landings, as did squadrons based in Australia and many US aircraft. Although the threat from Japanese fighter planes had all but disappeared and the RAAF fought not one single flying battle in 1945, enemy anti-aircraft fire was often formidable. Losses of aircraft and crews occurred at a rate not matched by the return, and in April, 8 senior RAAF officers were so sick of the wastefulness that they tried to resign their commissions in complaint. This so-called Maritime Mutiny brought some reforms, but reflected the frustrations that racked the RAAF in 1945. Exemplifying the losses were the 5 B-24 Liberators, pride of the RAAF bomber forces, that were lost in July, together with 48 crew members. This photograph depicts the crew of a Liberator which on the 27th of July was flying a photographic mission over the Celebes Islands when Japanese anti-aircraft fire shot it down. It caught fire and exploded against a hillside. 4 jumped from the plane before impact. 1, Flight Sergeant Charles Nicol, had no parachute and was killed instantly, as were the 8 aboard who didn't get out. One of the 3 who parachuted, Flight Sergeant John Orgill, landed in the garden of a Chinese family. They urged him to escape, but he waited to ascertain the fate of his comrades and was captured. On arriving at prison, he grabbed a bayonet from a guard and tried to fight his way out. 4 Japanese soldiers disarmed and beat him for half an hour, inflicting mortal wounds. The other 2 airmen, Sergeant Arnold Lockyer, an Indigenous man, not in the photo, and Pilot Officer George Linley, had been injured bailing out. Both were now brutally interrogated, some of the questioning reportedly concerning the recently dropped atomic bomb. Even the prosaic wording of the official report on their ultimate fate makes shocking reading. In the early hours of the morning of the 21st of August 1945, they were chloroformed and buried, probably alive, at Carton. Note the date, 6 days after the end of the war. Despite such heart-rending losses, in 1945, Australian servicemen achieved formidable success on every front. After repatriation, they had to adjust to a world without war. The official history notes that in 1945, Australian soldiers felt increasingly isolated from the civilian world, and that on home leave, they tended to seek each other's company in order to reminisce and to complain about civilian Australia. I'll never forget meeting a 2nd 43rd Battalion veteran in the 1980s who said how as a boy he'd been taught thou shalt not kill, but then in 1945 had been ordered to kill and done so. On returning to civilian life, he found it hard to readjust. He and the other veterans had fought to enable the Australia they knew to survive and grow. For that we should be eternally grateful. Thank you for listening.
Needed to move faster to get up here. Thank you, Mark. That was a real tour de force. And he covered such things as the Allies' use of steel, not flesh, the Allied approach to conducting combat operations in 1945, the tricky issue of combat effectiveness and morale, the necessity of the funnel campaigns, and he even touched on the Maritime Mutiny. So thank you very much for that. That was very impressive. We do have time for some questions from the audience. We have colleagues here who have Dr. David Sutton with the microphone and Dr. Thomas Rogers on the other side. If you have a question for Mark, number 1, please speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you. Question number 1.
You've given us detailed figures of the appalling casualties suffered by both sides. And the campaign that I'm most familiar with is Itapi-Wewak, because in which I have a personal interest. I lived in Wewak for a number of years, not long after the war had finished. As I understand it, some 440 Australians died in that campaign, 9,000 Japanese died, and an unknown number of Papua New Guineans died. Can you put a figure on the number of Papua New Guinean villagers who might have died having been inadvertently caught up in the fighting?
No, I wish I could. You make a very good point, and because the Papuan and New Guinean people are mentioned time and again in accounts of that campaign, and there were Papua New Guinea units which fought very effectively as part of the army, but also irregular New Guineans who played a formidable role helping the Australians, not just supplying them or tending the wounded, which is our classic image of them, but also fighting behind the lines. So, sorry, I don't have a number. I imagine you could look it up in something like the 3rd Force, the book about Angao, which has a lot of detail about what went on, or even Gavin Long's volume.
Another question for Mark? Oh, sorry, Stoney.
Thank you for a great discussion. I just wanted to make a statement that I remember my father telling me. He'd fought in Greece and Palestine before going to, he told me a story about he and his mate sitting on a ship watching over the railings of the landing at Balikpapan and saying to his mate, or vice versa, quoting Shakespeare about something along the lines of not having a heart for this battle. It's interesting that you raised this issue because he'd never discussed it any further than I assumed that he was saying they just had enough by then.
Yes.
But now flavouring it with the idea that the battles themselves were not all that useful to an overage campaign, I've got a different view about what he said. So just leaving you with another quote to reinforce that my dad had the same view as a lot of people that you were talking about.
Yes, that's really fascinating, yeah.
Just in the centre, Dave.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. You raised the issue of the two armies, the AIF, second AIF, and the militia. I'm just wondering if you could just briefly expand a little bit on the issues and the tensions of putting these two armies seamlessly, but they didn't really go seamlessly, into the field.
Yeah, so the AIF is an expeditionary force sent overseas, and of course when that force initially of 20,000 was raised in 1939, people looked back to the First World War, where the first AIF had been an amazing force as recognised by everyone. So there were many people who wanted to join it to be part of a new adventure and tradition, but not as many people joined up as the Australian government had hoped. Recruiting was not as fast as in the First World War, and in particular a group that didn't join up as avidly as the government expected was the militia, or CMF. Now that force had become very large. There were 80,000 members of the CMF at the start of World War II, whereas the permanent army was only 3,000. Those people had joined up largely because of an expectation that Japan might do something aggressive towards Australia in the years to come. They knew about the Japanese developing a navy with aircraft carriers, for example, and their aggression in China. And that was one of the reasons it's thought that militiamen didn't join the AIF in great numbers at the start. The pay for the militia was quite good. The militia couldn't be certain that the AIF was actually going to go overseas in the near future, so there were good reasons for militiamen not to join the AIF, and quite a few did, but as I say, not as many as expected, and that, I think, was a contributing factor to tension between the two groups in 1939, where men who did join the AIF used various critical terms of the militia. Most of you have probably heard the term chocos, chocolate soldiers who wouldn't melt in the sun, or who melt in the sun too readily. Koalas was another one, couldn't be exported or shot at. FIA, forced into action. So there was a lot of tension, and it never fully dissipated, even though many militiamen, as I said, did join the AIF within their units, even though militia units fought superbly in a lot of cases. Everyone's probably heard of the 39th Battalion, which did so well in 1942 on the Kokoda track and at Gona. But it's interesting too, the Australian Army disbanded that unit after that campaign, which was a bit of a slap in the face to militiamen who'd done so well. And it's interesting, you will have noticed that they were largely separated out from each other in 1945. In 1943 and 4, where we also undertook huge campaigns in New Guinea, the AIF did with the spearhead unit in the landings and most of the fighting, with the militia sort of followed them up. So I hope that sort of explains that the AAF thought they were the best. They did most of the fighting. The militiamen, a lot of them were too young to join the AAF when they joined it. So much of the criticism is really unfair of the militia, but it's also human nature, isn't it? If you're in one group, you tend to criticise another group. And you could see that it wasn't all one way. AAF men looked down on the militia resented the publicity, especially that went to the AAF.
Oh, that's it. Flurry questions up. 1, 2, and 3. Start the back to 4, 5. Keep track of that. 1, 2, 3.
Maybe I said something about the militia that's upset people.
The Middle East Mutual Appreciation Society, remember?
Yes,
Mark?
yeah.
Mark, excellent presentation. Just wanted to touch a little bit more on the command leadership versus the willingness to fight in those mutiny style things that you were discussing. I've seen poor leadership result in removal of command of flying squadrons, and it interests me to see whether it was a lack of willingness to fight or whether it was just poor command decisions at that LT colonel level.
I think it was poor command decisions, because you probably know some of these guys, in fact, just about all of them who were in the Maritime Mutiny were air aces, you know, Bobby Gibbs, Clive Caldwell, Wilf Arthur. They were all people who had really achieved things and they wanted to fight. Now, I looked at some stats just before this talk, how in late 1944, Wolf Arthur, as he was called, did some stats on the last 2 months. 15 aircraft had been lost by the 1st Tactical Air Force and 11 pilots. And in return, I think they destroyed 3 trucks and 6 barges. That sort of accounting that he did made them think, you know, what the heck are we doing? It's just not worth it. We're losing good people for nothing. Yeah, and you'd be aware there were all sorts of problems at the top of the Air Force too, with Jones and Bostock at the very top. So a classic one with that was where at Tarakan, when there was supposed to be this huge aerial bombardment beforehand, a lot of the aircraft didn't appear on the day of the attack on the 1st of May, and it was because Jones had ordered that they couldn't go out for some reason. And an American said to an Australian who was in one of the ships, "Oh, I feel sorry for you." Yeah, so what a humiliating moment for the Australian Air Force.
So it's question 2 down the front.
Thanks, Mark, for an interesting talk. I'm just wondering what happened to all the bodies of the dead Japanese and dead Australians. Who was responsible for the dead Japanese? Did the Japanese country actually take them back to Japan, or what happened with all the death and
Carl, you
bodies?
might know more about that than I do. I know there were, you know, there's the famous story of the Bone Man of Kokoda, isn't there, who went back, a guy, Nishimura, I think was his name, who went back to Kokoda after the war to find the bodies of Japanese and take ashes back to Japan. I don't think the Japanese have anything like I know they don't have anything like our... I think they're just buried in mass graves. There's a famous photo some of you will have seen of Australians sitting proudly with these Japanese helmets sitting on a mass grave that they've created. Yeah.
Yeah, it is sorry to jump in on that question, Mark. So there's, after actions, often typically Australians would they did bury the bodies of Japanese soldiers. So at the bottom of Slater's Knoll, for example, in southern Bougainville, photos of mass graves. But often all the attention to the Australian War Graves units focused their efforts on recovering and identifying and burying Australian war dead. They did bury some Japanese war dead, but they didn't go looking for them. And typically it's like, well, they're buried in Australian, there's a Japanese person there, they'll put them together. But in the main, and then after the war, you had small, the war graves units were then consolidated around Boona, Torrey-Canada, then later on, say, Bamana War Cemetery. But in the main, the Japanese tended to be buried where they fell or very close to them. They weren't actively buried, and it wasn't until the early 1950s, after the Japanese formal peace ceremony was surrender ceremony, the peace treaty was signed in the early 1950s, then Japanese delegations went across the Pacific trying to bury and identify the remains of Japanese war dead, and that's continued for decades since. And then even a few years ago, there were Japanese groups going back to Bougainville as well as New Guinea trying to locate the remains of Japanese. But in the main, most of those Japanese soldiers who were killed or died buried where they fell and have no known grave. And 100,000 Japanese soldiers died in New Guinea. Not really. And there was a very sad story of it's a forgotten Japanese war cemetery near Bamana, which was abandoned for decades because immediately after the end of the war, at the end of the Second World War, no one wanted to take responsibility for paying to maintain the cemetery. And where there's a big jail outside of Port Moresby in the Bamana area, that covers part of the old Japanese war cemetery. It's actually an unknown and very sad story because post-war no one was prepared to look up to maintain for the graves or to pay for them.
Gee, that's really fascinating. I didn't know that, and it makes me think of Alamein, which I started the whole talk with, where there's wonderful monuments to the German and Italian dead. Yeah.
It's a very different tradition.
Yeah.
We had question 3 was in the middle. I thought you were 5. Yep, jump in 4, and then 5 was Ian. So 4.
Thank you, Mark, very much for an interesting presentation. The one oboe op you didn't talk about was at Brunei Bay, and I'm wondering if you can shed any light on what happened there. My dad was involved in that landing on the 10th of June, and I would also be interested, I've never quite got my head around the difference between the Brunei Bay and the Labuan landings. If you could speak to that, please.
Yeah. Well, Brunei Bay is the 20th Brigade. I'm actually writing a book at the moment about the 2nd 17th Battalion, which was involved in the Brunei Bay ones. That was one where the casualties were lightest. The Japanese offered weak resistance and were pushed back rapidly. And maybe the most famous part of that campaign is the oil fires that were set at Seria in Borneo, which that brigade had to deal with. Labuan was part of the 24th Brigade's landings, which were also in North Borneo. They had more bitter fighting, in particular at a place called Beaufort, when Starcevic won the VC. So North Borneo was the easiest of the Borneo campaigns, but there were still casualties in every unit, and the soldiers fought very effectively. It's interesting that at the end of the North Borneo campaign, a flag that was adopted temporarily by the locals there had the 9th Division's symbol on it, the T-patch. So, yes. What unit was your father in? Ah, yes. Great 9th Division artillery unit. Yeah.
Just down the front again, Dave.
Thank you. I'll preface my question by thanking you for your presentation. For me, it's been personally very revealing, so thank you. But the question is this: should those campaigns have been fought at all? You showed a book by Peter Charlton which called them the unnecessary war. Gavin Long, in his official history, the final campaign as a little non-committal. He reports troop dissatisfaction, but he doesn't say the campaign shouldn't have been fought. The Japanese should merely have been contained so they couldn't get back to Japan to help in the final struggle there. 80 years later, do you have an opinion? Should those campaigns have been fought or not? Hard question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I try not to have opinions about the strategic questions, but I think there's an argument, isn't there, for just keeping them as garrisons and holding the Japanese there. But at the same time, you can understand the government and the army feeling they needed to do something with the troops who were restless, although some of them didn't want to fight, particularly. At the same time, there was a concern with the government that after the war, Australia would be able to hold its head up high and say we were fighting from the beginning to the end. At the same time, the campaigns like Borneo, it's very obvious that even high commanders at the time were thinking we really don't need to do this. So my answer's a partial. I'm sitting on the fence, really. I can see arguments both ways, and it's hard to see how we couldn't have done something in that last year. Yeah.
I'd say yes, they were necessary, apart from Ballypappin. We have time for one last question, if anyone would like to contribute. All right, great. Then I'll use my prerogatives, Chair. Mark, as someone who's written a dozen books in Australian military history, and so many of them about the Australian Army, as an author, what do you think's left? Like, what's those one or two big questions that no one's really addressed or haven't gone back to since Gavin Long in the official history series?
Gosh, what a great question. I think the one that, we were talking earlier about this new biography about Gavin Long, so I've been thinking a lot about him as you have. One of the things that was said was it a pity the official history didn't have a volume about prisoners of the Japanese. So maybe big work on that becomes the standard work. That's a gap. I know every year I get boys in my elective class called Australians at War to write about topics that interest them about Australian military history, and lots of them want to do prisoners of war, and there's not really one book that you can say this has got nearly everything you're going to need. So that's one that comes to mind immediately. Some of the commanders probably still deserve biographies that don't have them, or only brief ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
At this point, I can hear my colleague Dr Lachlan Grant talking about the official histories and the POWs. Do make the point that you do have the... Oh, actually, Dave, can you give it to Locke? So Dr Lachlan Grant's another historian at the Memorial. He's done a lot of work at POWs in the Second World War, as well as other topics.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the paper sale. It was terrific. I think Carl is referring to a point that we made in our book we authored with Joan Beaumont and Aaron Pegram, Beyond Surrender. And we looked at that question about that there was an official volume on POWs, and it was talked about by Gavin Long. But what we did is we added up all the pages relating to the POWs across the various volumes, including the medical volumes, and there's something like 980 pages. So
wow.
If they had have put them all together, you'd actually have a volume on the POWs themselves if it had have been arranged differently.
Oh, that's interesting. I think if you gave me 15 minutes, I'd probably come up with some other topics as you put me on the spot there.
Oh, that's the point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Oh, sorry.
Just one,
no, yep.
the one that you're doing at the moment on Australians in Northwest Europe. That's really interesting project.
Sorry, you heard it first. That's myself, Dr Lachlan Grant, and Michael Kelly. So that's our topic. Get your own. But on that, thank you very much, Mark, for this presentation today. It was fantastic. And thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon. There's no point in us hosting these events if we don't have people attending in the audience, being present, participating and asking questions. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Peeps. Thank you very much.